My name is David Larson. I'm a teacher in the Faculty of Religion at Loma Linda University, and I want to welcome you to a very special conversation. A conversation with Dr. Jack W. Provonsha, who is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy of Religion and Christian Ethics at Loma Linda University, an institution with which he has been associated for the better part of 3 decades. Dr. Provonsha is an ordained Christian minister. He is a practicing physician. He is a philosopher of religion, a biomedical ethicist, an artist, a sculptor, and best of all, a very good friend to many people here and all around the world. We are in his home near the Puget Sound in the state of Washington, a home which he shares with Dr. Margaret Provonsha, who is also a physician. We are going to explore the life and the thought, the views and the values of a very keen observer of human nature and a very deep thinker about matters that are most important to all of us. So I invite you to relax and to enjoy a most important conversation with a most important figure. Thank you for joining us. Jack, we're delighted we're here, and the first thing we want to say is thank you for letting us come into your home. Here we are overlooking the water, and it may be that while we're conversing, a ship will pass by, or we'll see an eagle or a sea lion out here, and we're just delighted that you allowed us to come into your home and talk with you today.
Thank you for coming.
We want to begin by thinking a little bit about your life. You've done so many different things, and you are now doing so many different things, any one of which would be a life's work for many people. And I suppose many folk would wonder how it is that you happen to come to this point in your life with so many different kinds of labels: doctor, minister, teacher, philosopher, and so forth. What happened along your life's journey that resulted in this combination of professional skills and personal interests?
You're asking a very big question, of course. I'm not sure it was all planned in advance. We just took advantage of things that came along. And it was my privilege to be in a number of interesting places at interesting times. For example, my bioethics role. I became interested in ethics back in the day when bioethics was scarcely known. Back in my day, there were only just 2 bioethicians of note who had written on the subject. One was Willard Sperry, the dean of Harvard Divinity School. The other was Joseph Fletcher, who was there at the Episcopal Theological Seminary. They'd both written books, but prior to that, there wasn't even courses you take to become an ethicist. I began my graduate work in philosophy of religion with an emphasis on Christian ethics. And then later, as time developed, my interest increased, and we sort of cut out a spot for Christian ethics at a place where Christian ethics is a highly important issue, that is at a medical school that has Christian emphasis.
Mm-hmm. Now let's go way back to the beginning. We're already at Harvard with you spending time with Willard Sperry and Joseph Fletcher and intellectual giants like that. But your life didn't begin, I take it, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but it began where?
76 years ago this month, I was born in a little small frame house, 446 West 4th South, Provo, Utah.
You remember the address yet?
Oh, yes. We were Adventists. My Adventist roots go back for 4 generations. My great-grandfather was an Adventist preacher. I was the next one in line. I went to a church school, one-room church school, through 10 grades. 9 years, I skipped the 3rd grade. 9 years in Provo Church School, and then moved to California, where I became involved at Mountain View Academy.
That's in the Bay Area.
That's
San
right.
Francisco.
That's right. Mm-hmm. We were there before the electronics industry took over the valley.
Oh, yes.
We had mostly prunes and apricots when I was there.
So it was not the Silicon Valley then?
No, it was not. From Mountain View Academy, I went to PUC, Pacific Union College, and began my tortuous career of trying to earn my way into an education. W.I. Smith, who was president of Pacific Union College, came looking for students, and he came to Mountain View Academy, and he sat down with me, and we talked a bit, and I told him, well, how can I go to PUC when I only have $100 to my name? He said, come on, we'll work out something. And he did, and I finished PUC in 5 years, working my way through. I left home at 15. My parents were divorced about that time, and I had no home to go back to, so I was on my own at 15. But the University of Hard Knocks was a very useful preparation for greater usefulness, and I took advantage of it. While I was at Mountain View Academy, I paid my way through the academy working as a houseboy for a professor from Stanford and his wife at Stanford University, taking care of their yard and looking after the two little boys and bathing them and feeding them and doing general things around the house. Then after PUC, well, there are 2 or 3 points of interest that had great consequence to my future. One of these occurred during my junior year at PUC. My interests were fairly wide, and I was interested in scientific things as well as religious and philosophic things. And I wondered how one could apply those 2 interests in a consonant fashion with each other. And I was taking a course in Spirit of Prophecy from Mary Cook McReynolds.
Spirit of Prophecy, meaning what would that cover?
Ellen White's writings.
That was the title of the course regarding Ellen White.
She offered a course.
And who taught it?
Mary Cook McReynolds. She was a woman who had illusions of being Ellen White much of the time.
Oh, really?
But she introduced me to a book that I didn't know existed before that. It was a compilation entitled Medical Ministry. And in that book I found references to a combined ministry in which the work of a clergyman and physician could combine in a useful and even more fruitful way than either one by themselves. And that thing began to gel in my mind, and I walked home from the college to my wife. I was married during the during the 3rd year of my stay at PUC, my sweetheart from Mountain View. And I went home that afternoon and told her that I had decided what I wanted to do. She said, what? I said, I'm going to study medicine and add this to my ministry so that I could be a minister and doctor. She wasn't very enthusiastic about the notion. We had been already spent 1 year working our way through, and she was looking forward to the day we'd be finished. Well, as it happened, financially it was impossible even to think about studying medicine at that stage. So I accepted a call to the Nevada, Utah conference as a ministerial intern. And there I worked for nearly 2 years and received an invitation to come to Alaska to be a minister in Fairbanks, Alaska. I was in Fairbanks, Alaska for a couple of years. And 1 week in Fairbanks, Alaska changed my whole life. In many ways unexpected, yet quite obvious and logical. My first wife, who was pregnant at the time, suffered from eclampsia and died, and left me a baby. And of course, there's no way I could stay by and be a pastor of a church and look after a premature baby at the same time. So I left and took this as the occasion to go back to medicine and learned what I should have known probably in Fairbanks. She was not well handled in her pregnancy, and this consequently resulted in her demise. Well, after her death, I went through 1 year at PUC, finished up my pre-med in 1 year, worked as assistant dean of men at the Pacific Union College, made my way through that year, and then was accepted in medicine. And while I was in medical school, met my lovely present wife. She was 1 year ahead of me. And we married when I was a senior and she was an intern. And then after finishing medical school, we went in for my internship at Washington Sanitarium, the old Washington Sanitarium, where I worked as an intern for a year. And then we went to California and practiced replacement practice for somebody who was fulfilling his requirement in the military. And for 2 years, then we went to Alaska again for 2 years and operated a hospital in Homer and Seldovia.
Where in Alaska?
Homer and Seldovia.
I'm sorry, where is that?
That's down the end of the Kenai Peninsula, about 150 miles from Anchorage.
I see.
I preached sermons on Sabbaths and held evangelistic meetings in the evening, worked in the office, seeing patients during the day. We advertised that we did womb-to-tomb service in our hospital.
Womb-to-tomb service, okay.
And discovered that my dreams as a junior student at the PUC were impossible fulfillment. Nobody could do all those things and expect to survive. So we were there for 2 years. Then I received an invitation to come and teach at Loma Linda. And I accepted this as a possibility of, while not being able to fulfill the dream because of physical limitations, I could be able to help to increase the sense of idealism that medical students might have as they prepared for their ministry, to keep in mind the spiritual emphasis that was so necessary.
Okay. So it was after you had returned to Loma Linda as a professor that you continued your work at Harvard University and Claremont Graduate School, am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
I had a master's from Harvard, and then I finished my PhD at Claremont.
Okay. Now, as you think back over that span of time, beginning in Provo, Utah, then moving to California, then to Northern California, Pacific Union College, then to Alaska, and then back, and then to Loma Linda, having spent then some time at Harvard and at Claremont, are there people who stand out as having had a decisive impact on your developing thought from any of those periods of time? From your earliest years, you were 9 years in that very intensive educational experience at Provo. What do you think you learned there?
I learned who I was. It wasn't a very good education. This was a little country.
You say it was a good or not good?
This wasn't a very good education,
Not
probably,
good.
in terms of didactic material.
Mm-hmm.
The teachers were mostly beginning teachers who were fresh out of college, and they'd come to work with us for 1 year, then move on. But I learned who I was. In a small church school with 2 big public schools between me and my home, between the school and my home, it involved a good deal of pressure, emotional pressure on a small boy, having to walk past these 2 big public schools to go to the little broken down church school. But it also gave me a sense of being set apart. And that has a certain contribution to make the success for a person to have a sense of purpose, a sense of identity.
So what you gained there was not so much knowledge, but a sense of mission, identity, purpose.
That's correct.
I
knew who I was, and I never forgot that I was an Adventist, even when I was doing my graduate study.
How about that? Was that sense of purpose and identity as an Adventist Christian quite constant then for you for the rest of your life?
Pretty much, yes.
Mm-hmm.
There were times when the road was a little deserted, and when I was very much alone. I had to answer Paul Tillich's questions in Paul Tillich's class, with no other Adventists around to help, no one around who understood Paul Tillich or had read his writings to try to work that thing through. It was rather rough going on occasion. I remember one day when a visitor came to see me who was thinking of taking graduate work at Harvard. Well, Jim Cox, you remember Jim Cox?
Yes, of course.
He came and introduced himself. We found a quiet little place where we could talk. We talked all day long, practically all night long. He forgot to tell his wife that he wasn't coming home for dinner. We had a marvelous day together. But this was an indication of the loneliness that I experienced during that graduate training program.
But the connection I think I'm hearing is one between the loneliness you experienced as a youngster in Provo, going to the small school in between 2 much larger schools, and then a similar, though in many ways different kind of loneliness you experienced at Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Harvard Divinity School, when being quizzed by the likes of Paul Tillich about your faith. And Provo, in a sense, prepared you for Provo prepared you for Harvard, in a sense, at least to be able to stand on your own, I take it. Am I hearing you correctly?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. What about your years at PUC? Were there theological influences there that were significant for your later thought? You mentioned this one book, Medical Ministry, that had a decisive impact on your career. But what about your emerging philosophy and theology? Was PUC a fertile time for you, or perhaps
it
not?
really was not. It was a comfortable time in the sense that I was not in an environment where I was under pressure. But beyond that, nothing really happened very much, except gradual things. They're hard to go back and point out as moments when things took place. So it's really kind of a waiting time. And
now, when you returned to Loma Linda, and at that time I think you were serving in Los Angeles, at the Los Angeles...
I started there, yes.
Okay. How was that in terms of your intellectual development, that chapter of your life, the Loma Linda period? Particularly, I'm thinking now of the earliest portion of your service at Loma Linda.
Well, the earliest portion of my service at Loma Linda was before I was teaching there. As a student, I began to come alive. I became introduced to ideas in a way that I had not been introduced to them before in the classes of Arthur L. Beets, who became a very close personal friend and one who invited me to come and teach later.
Arthur Beets, would one say properly that Arthur Beets was a significant person in your theological development?
My first major mentor.
Is that right?
And while we had some differences, the facts are he opened some windows. I became familiar with Tillich's writings there and Brunner and others, that he was an omnivorous reader. And he was delighted to have somebody showing an interest in, because most medical students were not interested in such things. And we had a good time together.
I don't want to overplay this, but would it be fair to say that Dr. Arthur Beets, a psychologist and a minister as well, widened your theological horizons and broadened your world considerably? Would that be putting it too far?
I would say that he was the single most influential character in my intellectual development.
He was or was not?
He was.
He was. Is that right? Arthur Beets. Okay. Now his interests were somewhat parallel to the interests that you have subsequently developed, because you're not merely a theologian and ethicist, but also have taught psychiatry, and he's a psychologist as well as a minister. So that interaction has continued over the years for you, hasn't it?
The interest was not so much cognitive, in the sense that I learned a great deal from him in a didactic way. Rather, he opened windows so that I began to find my own way. And that providing an atmosphere of openness was what was so crucial about his influence on my life.
It's almost as though the little schoolhouse in Provo gave you a sense of self, and then your experience with Arthur Beets opened up those windows so you could, that self that was so secure could now experience the whole world much more fully.
I think that's right.
Now, were there any crises of thought? You've mentioned a horrific experience through which you passed in Alaska, when you lost your wife and had to abandon your ministry and your medical practice there and really rebuild your life. That was a personal setback of great proportion. Was that accompanied by any deep spiritual pondering on your part, or did you take that spiritually and theologically pretty much in stride?
Well, in stride, how does one stride through such a situation? The questions became very pressing. That is, I sat by her bedside while she died. I tried to revive her, as a matter of fact. Before that, I'd anointed her with oil. The local Lutheran pastor's wife was the nurse who was looking after her. She came and joined me. We anointed her with oil and prayed for her. And I said, "Dear Lord, if you want her, you can take her." Later, when I was telling Mrs. Cavness the story, she said, "Oh no." And I learned, "Oh no," along the way. God wept along with me. I learned how to handle sorrow and difficulty. And it was a growing experience, even though it was a tragic one.
So that was a tremendous, you mentioned earlier, your whole life changed in 1 week there. Now, when you went to Harvard,
I should add a couple more dimensions to that 1 week. I was ordained to the ministry. We organized the Fairbanks, Alaska Church. I was the one who was the preacher of note in the organization of Fairbanks, Alaska Church. There's 3 of them there now. And then my wife died, and I was enrolled at Pacific Union College in the pre-med course, all within a week or 2.
Oh my, that's pretty high on the scale of stress.
And if you think it wasn't tough taking biochemistry at Pacific Union College under those stressful circumstances, you think again, it's a very, very difficult year, scholarly. But it was time the Lord sustained me, and it was, I think, an important part of my development.
Why is it that along the way you never said, enough of Adventism for me? I think I'll find my spiritual sustenance in some other community.
I suppose it's my independent spirit. I was not dependent upon people who did not attract me. And individuals whose grasp of theology were not up to dealing with my questions scarcely were much of a threat.
So those folk within the Adventist community who seemed to be spiritually unhelpful didn't threaten you much. Did you find anything positive? What was it they're positive about the Adventist community, particularly theologically, that you found worth sticking by?
Again, it was a gradual growing thing. Walter Utt and I were close friends. You know Walter Utt?
Yes, the historian at Peak
Yes, that's right.
College.
We were classmates in a Bible doctrines course. I think we drove the Bible doctrines teacher up the walls, asking questions, foolish questions, some not so foolish ones. But the companionship of a person like that in an environment where the professor was wise enough not to push too hard, and that helped to provide the open door that would later be of value to me.
So Walter Utt, Arthur Dietz, these were significant people in your life. How about at Harvard? Were there teachers there that you found particularly helpful at the time that you were there?
I was never very close to the teachers at Harvard, partly because of my own shyness. I really wasn't prepared to get in that kind of environment by a long period of conditioning. But Paul Lehman, I took ethics from Paul Lehman, the author of Ethics in a Christian Context.
Yes.
He's given me my best definition of what ethics is all about. You remember the definition we said ethics is what God is doing in the world to keep human life human.
Yes, yes. Have you made very good use of that over the years?
Well, he was my professor.
Mm-hmm. And you knew Joseph Fletcher there?
Yes. We were close friends.
And Paul Tillich?
Yes. Not close friends, but he came to speak at Loma Linda at my request later on.
Mm-hmm. And they knew you were an Adventist Christian?
Yes. Paul Lehman's first response was, I knew an Adventist once. I should have asked him what he knew about it. I didn't.
Did you feel that they treated you harshly because of your Adventism?
Much more open spirit toward me there than I would say I would have had at Andrews University.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
Liberals tend to be personality so constructed that they very rarely make sharp closure on people.
Mm-hmm. When you think of this journey as a whole, all the way from Provo, here we are near the Puget Sound in Washington, are there some themes that sort of stand out to you as the lessons of life that you've learned?
I think I'd have to say that what has happened to me mainly is an answer to J.B. Phillips' concern that most people these days have much too small a conception of God. My growing conception of God was the most important thing that happened to me. And I'm prepared to deal with the Hubble telescope and the evolutionary hypothesis and other things that I would not have been able to come to grips with had I not had the openness of the environment that Harvard and Claremont both provided.
Well, is there a sharp difference between the view of God you had as a youngster in Provo and the view of God, I should say, that you have here at this point in your life?
Not sharp in the sense of a sudden contrast. It's been a gradual development. And to come up with a notion, for example, which is my present status in regard to the kind of person God is, a book by Paul Davies. Are you familiar with Paul Davies?
I am, yes.
A physicist. He wrote a book, The Mind of God. He begins that book with a statement, kind of a warning that he does not believe in a personal God. Then he spends a whole book exploring the implications for religion, of faith. And the last sentence in his book, after having summed up a variety of extraordinary things that made it possible for there to be human life in the universe, the nature of atoms and all the rest of it. And then he says at the end of his book, we were intended to be here. How he could reconcile his statements at the beginning of the book, he didn't believe in a personal God, and then say something in the universe was intending something. It sounds like a failure to understand his expression personal. I developed a sense of personality out of dealing with that aspect of the conception of God.
Now, you have indicated how your understanding of God has changed over the years. It's expanded. It's larger. How would you describe your own personal relationship with God as it's taken place over the years? Not merely intellectually, but existentially, we might say.
You've seen the little back of the bulletin article that I prepared for the church.
I have, yes. A few paragraphs you prepared for the people who worship here, yes.
It has to do primarily with the nature of God.
Yes.
And my conception of God now is broad enough to deal with the Hubble telescope. A few months ago, we received a National Geographic magazine that had an article on Orion Nebula. Did you see that?
I didn't, no.
Marvelous, beautiful photography. And they sent a little insert that was a close-up picture of Orion and an account of the size and magnificence of it. A beautiful picture. And the size and magnificence of it, 100 light years across that nebula, 10,000 suns at its central point, all kinds of interesting things that is very exciting and beautifully done. And I remembered Galileo Galilei make the observation that the sun, with all of its obligations in the solar system, with planets and other things dependent upon it, still has time to ripen a bunch of grapes on a hillside in Judea.
Oh my, let's stop just there. Let's stop there. What a magnificent line from Galileo.
Yes.
Now, when we come back, let's probe more fully this expanded view of God that has come to be so precious to you. Thank you all for joining us for this first part of our conversation with Jack Provonsha. When we return, we will talk further with him about his understanding of God and how that understanding of God enriches his life and might enrich ours as well. Thank you very much. Hello, welcome to our continuing conversation with Dr. Jack Provonsha, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy of Religion and Christian Ethics at Loma Linda University. Dr. Provonsha is a physician and an ordained minister, a philosopher of religion, a biomedical ethicist, and a person who has thought deeply about God and humanity. That's the topic of our current conversation. When we concluded the first portion of our talk together, Dr. Provonsha indicated that over the course of the years of his life and thought, his understanding of God has widened and deepened. And we want to probe that just a little bit with him this afternoon as we sit in his home overlooking the Puget Sound near Seattle, Washington. Thanks once again, Jack, for continuing this conversation with us. We greatly appreciate this opportunity to converse with you.
My pleasure.
We have here something you have written within the last month that I take to be an accurate summary of your current understanding of things. And I would like to read these 3 paragraphs and invite you to comment here and there on what you have written. This is something Dr. Provonsha wrote in order to help the people at the church at which he and his wife, Dr. Margaret Provonsha, worship week by week. It's entitled A Call to Worship. He has written this: "We invite you to join us as we worship the eternal Father, the majesty of heaven, who through his Son is creator and sustainer of a vast universe, yet by his Spirit is closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. He it is who has come to us in the sacred writings of holy men and women throughout the ages, in his Son who walked among us, and in these latter days through a called people under the influence of ongoing prophetic inspiration. The Son lived and died to reveal the Father's unconditional love and to enable mankind to experience ransom from guilt and power for victorious living. He conquered death and then ascended to the courts of heaven, where he continues to represent in judgment those who respond to his love and follow him wherever he leads. He promised, further, to return to this world in these last days to gather his faithful followers from among the living and from among the dead by resurrection, and to take them to dwell forevermore in a heavenly home he has prepared for them. To love and to worship so exalted a Savior is to be obedient in all things to his divine will, and to live simply and in moral purity. It is to be sensitive to the needs of one's neighbor, to protect and preserve the creation, the natural environment, as well as one's own physical body, and to remember the Sabbath day according to the commandment. Come worship with us. These are Dr. Provonsha's own words as written not long ago for the very congregation in which he and Dr. Margaret Provonsha worship week by week, an invitation to others to worship with them there. Jack, you use many provocative terms here, one of which is that couplet of terms that refers to God as creator and sustainer. Now, you're a theologian, but you're also a scientist, one who has been trained in the human sciences. And also you have knowledge of geology and astronomy. And you know how many people doubt that it's worthwhile to think of a creator and sustainer who has somehow become responsible for the fact that we are here. And yet you continue to use such language. Why? Why should we talk about God in those terms today?
First of all, you should know the basis for the writing of this document. It was an attempt to bring life to a church bulletin, for one thing. But my attempt was to capture the essence of my belief system, the church to which I belong, in a brief format that could put on the back of a bulletin. And I think I have captured every one of the 27 doctrines of Adventist belief in one way or another in this document. But the question you ask is, of course, an elaboration on a theme. You will notice that I have room for both the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Yet I do not become polytheistic in my appraisal of God in the process. My conception of God is a oneness of God with various dimensions of emphasis. Hebrews 1 tells us about the Father being creating through his Son, and being the sustainer through the Son. So this is a scriptural statement. And I add to this the dimension of my own sources based upon the writings of Ellen White, in which she makes an observation that God was not dependent upon previously existing matter for the creation of this world. In other words, the world comes into existence as a result of God's own action, not something borrowed. He is not dependent upon a shelf load of creative objects to draw on to build this world, the universe. He simply speaks and it is so. So we're talking about a creative source that can neither be confirmed nor disconfirmed. accept certain logical support for it. For example, if you say now, in terms of the EMC squared notion, you'd have to say God was not dependent upon previous existing energy for creation either. So all of the energy in the universe, and since energy and matter are now interchangeable by Einstein's theory of relativity, interchangeable, this means then that everything that is, including its actions, are somewhere related to the Creator's power. God is therefore that without which there would be nothing. If God were to remove his power from you or from this desk, nothing would remain except a vacuum. Everything is ultimately dependent upon him, and he's therefore in touch with everything. It has all kinds of implications about the presence of God in this life. That God is in touch with everything that is, as its sustainer and creator, therefore nothing escapes his attention. God is transcendent, but he's also immanent. So immanent that even closer than hands and feet through his spirit.
Mm-hmm. Let me try some alternative views of God on you and see what you like and don't like about them, all right? First of all, pantheism. Is pantheism, in your view, a viable doctrine of God?
It's a partial view of God. Pantheism is correct in what it says, but the things that it does not say is what makes the difference.
It's helpful in what respect?
In what respect is that it gives the notion of immanence, God's closeness to us. It does not take care of the need for divine intervention, divine leadership, divine authorization, divine power, and for personality.
Mm-hmm. Let me try another one. How about deism? Could you be a deist, Jack?
Again, we're partial. That God does, in fact, stand remote from some activities that go on in the world that is remote in a sense. Yet, since he's a sustainer, I'd have to say that deism is at fault in its failing to recognize the immanence of God. God is transcendent or distant, but he's not close. And therefore, our scriptural awareness of God is disturbed by a sense of his total presence.
So if pantheism makes God too present, or exclusively too present,
yes,
deism sometimes makes God
too remote.
Too remote.
Yes.
Remote. Well, let me try another one on you then. How about polytheism? Why not be a polytheist?
Because polytheism in its very basic essence is a situation of conflict. Just as soon as you have three elements, these three stand apart from each other. And the unity of Scripture regarding the nature of the oneness of God is so important an element that if you take the Scripture at all seriously, you have to say that God is not in conflict with other parts of himself, as a Roman polytheist would be, for example. The Roman pantheon is filled with all kinds of struggles and conflicts between individuals who are in conflict.
And these conflicts are in the heart of God's own self.
Itself, that's correct.
According to polytheism.
That's correct.
Well, let me try another one. How about henotheism? Sometimes we hear that term.
Again, this is a partial problem. It's not a partial statement, but it is not a statement regarding God. It's a statement regarding human insufficiency. That is, when God is my God, and you have your God and I have mine, individual gods, again, you have the polytheistic conflict.
Tribal deities.
Correct. And when you have tribal deities, you have tribal deities in conflict with each other. So again, the unity of reality is called into question by the multiplication of deities.
Would I be right to say that for you, the doctrine of creation emphasizes the unity at the heart of things?
At the heart of things, yes, absolutely.
So reality, as we find it throughout the whole universe, for you is not intrinsically conflictual? Is that true?
That's correct. This is the essence of the notion, Hear, O Israel, our Lord is one God, the Shema. The essence of it is that it all belongs together. God is a holistic God. It has various dimensions, but it's a multi-dimensional unity. And unity takes priority over the dimensions.
Okay, how about the notion of panentheism? Does that...
that comes closer to what I
Closer?
Yes, than the others you outlined. Panentheism preserves the notion of the universality of God, but also that God is beyond just everything. If you were to take everything out of the universe, you wouldn't take God out. God takes priority over his creation. And that position of God in relationship to his creation gives the authority and power to the notion of God.
Okay, now I've sometimes heard people use the expression radical monotheism. What do you think of that?
It's to take the panentheistic position and put it into close proximity to the problems that it solves. Radical monotheism is one in which the body, for example, is a multidimensional unity. And to put that in practice is to give it a radical form. At its roots. The word term radical comes from the term roots. We even in clinical medicine talk about radiculitis. Radiculitis is nerve root irritation. A radical is a root. And radical pantheism, radical monotheism,
yes.
Radical monotheism is an expression of God's oneness at a very practical and holistic level.
Okay.
Which at every dimension of our lives we participate in that
Well,
wholeness.
let's probe that practical and holistic level just a bit. Why should I, as a postmodern individual, care about these different views of God? What difference might it make in how I order my daily life? What difference might it make in how I spend my money? The kinds of things I do with my discretionary time, as you see it, Jack?
The facts of the case are you can't not care. We're dealing here with the human situation in its relationship to God. We're all human beings. We all share the same radical feelings of estrangement. The human problem is universal. Everyone experiences it, regardless of how he expresses it. For an atheist to come and tell me he doesn't believe in God, who still aches, is an atheist who is not being true to his humanity. In other words, as long as we're human beings, we have the human problems, and it's there, and there's no way you can avoid it. So even that significant number of people who express belief in God, and 80% of people say they believe in God, but I'm reminded of Bertrand Russell's statement that Christians do not believe in God, they merely believe in believing. So there's a kind of a casual approach to God that is a denial of the reality.
Are you saying it's impossible, Jack, to be an atheist, really?
Yes. Without a real positive, or shall I say a negative thrust. It takes an effort to be an unbeliever. Now, it doesn't take effort to be an unbeliever in the wrong kind of God.
Right.
But an encounter with the God of Scripture, you have to put forth an effort not to be incorporated into his love.
Now, if you're saying it's exceedingly difficult, maybe even impossible for a human being consistently to be an atheist, you're saying something not only about God, but you're saying something about us, aren't you?
Yes.
What are you saying about human beings when you speak that way? I'm reminded of John Calvin's comment that all of our knowledge can be summed up in our knowledge of God on the one hand and of ourselves on the other, and they are so interrelated it's hard to know which one comes first.
Well, I think it is impossible to isolate the one from the other. But the notion of God is at a higher, a more exalted and more universal level than that which pertains to human feelings of alignment.
Now, we've talked some about human beings. Let's shift a little bit to the humanity side of this equation. We've talked some about human beings as symbol makers, as tool makers, as animals which have opposed thumbs and so forth. Are there any other ways in which humans are distinguished from other beings on this planet, as you discern it?
Yes, I think the distinction is a very important one. Charles Darwin's contribution was not facilitating the theory of evolution, but rather putting man into nature, the naturalizing of man. Since Darwin was taken seriously, man is no longer the image of God, something special, specially created, specially endowed. He is rather an expression of the nature around him. And therefore the origins and destiny of nature are also man's origins and destiny. Man's values reflect his participation in nature.
Now, when you use the term image of God, that links the understanding we have of ourselves with our understanding of God. Tell us more, though, what we ought to hear when we use that expression, image of God. If I say, you are created in God's image, or I am created in God's image, What specifically and concretely are we speaking of?
Specifically and concretely, it has to do with awareness.
Awareness of?
Awareness of our awareness.
Aha.
In other words, to be aware, to be conscious, in other words, the great mystery of consciousness. We are consciously aware, but we're also aware that we are aware. And God is not only aware of us, He's aware of all of our destiny, our being, all the transforming and important aspects of our existence. God is aware of that, but He is also self-aware. Now, to say that God is this, and man is this, and this gives a tie between God and man, in which they belong together in the Imago Dei formula.
Imago Dei meaning?
Image of God.
Yes. Okay, let me share with you some ways in which God is sometimes described, and maybe you can comment on them. We speak sometimes, for instance, of the wrath of God. How do you understand that?
The wrath of God is not human wrath. The wrath of God is an expression of His total dismay at what man has done with his creative gifts. God's feeling of horror, if you please, even at the estrangement of man. I think the cross is the clearest example in human suffering of what God has always felt when there's estrangement in His universe.
The cross, say that again for me, please. The cross is what?
The cross is a disclosure of the agony that God experienced over the estrangement of His creatures from Him.
But don't many people view the cross as God's angry punishment of sinners in a substitutionary way?
I'm sure, and I think this is wrong. I think that the cross is an expression of God's participation in the human problem. As a loving Father, He cannot escape the agony, as every earthly parent suffers agony when his children are alienated from him. Only God, at the intensity of God's experience and ability to experience, God encounters that agony more intensely than anything human beings can possibly imagine.
And is it your understanding that God has been so agonized for centuries before the cross
Yes.
and after the cross?
Yes.
What difference then did the cross make in all of this?
The cross is the clearest expression that God has been able to give to man. Because God has wanted to tell us about this estrangement and its consequences. And we look at the cross and say, I did it. I did it to Him. And this is what God feels as He is to behold my alienation from Him. And the repentance that can come from that discovery has all kinds of potential for transformation.
Now, I hope we can explore this further in just a bit, but maybe I can try some other ways of describing God before we do so. Sometimes we speak of God's providence. What does that expression suggest to you?
God's intervention of one sort or another. And I'm not sure what question you're asking about that.
Do you think God does intervene in our lives? Or is that a superstitious conviction that should be discarded by all thoughtful people, the notion of an intervening deity?
It's not an either-or thing. God sometimes, when it is necessary, intervenes. He does not intervene capriciously, lest the misconception of God become protected by that involvement. But He enters into human experience as much as is necessary, but then gives us the picture of the behind the scenes when the time is right.
Okay, another expression that we sometimes use, and you use it here in your text, that is a reference to the unconditional love of God. What does that mean?
He does not wait until we are lovable before He loves us. There are no preconditions for God's expression of love toward us. That's the way He is. He is by nature a loving, nurturing, saving being. And He cannot be otherwise than this and still be God.
Now, this unconditional love of God, which we experience, you've said He loves us even before we love God.
While we were yet sinners, Paul says.
Right. Now, to whom does that word "we" refer? Does it refer to those of us sitting in this room, to those who belong to the same church we do?
The term unconditional includes the dimension you're asking for. In other words, God so loved the world He didn't love one person more than another. Sometimes he could have a greater usefulness of one person over another, or one group over another. He called the people when he called Israel for a purpose. But God's love extends to all men everywhere, and he weeps when they turn away from his love.
Now, some Christians genuinely believe that all those who have not heard about Jesus Christ explicitly and have not responded to the good news that comes in Jesus Christ are for that reason and that reason alone forever lost. How do you feel about that?
This is to trivialize the name. The name is not just a word. The name represents the power of God. Nobody can be saved without the power of God being involved in the salvation process. And for man to turn against God's power expressed is to reject the name.
Is there any likelihood in your view that there will be some who have been saved by Jesus Christ's power without having heard his name?
The name quotes. Maybe Joshua, Yeshua, or whatever. But worshiping God ignorantly is to truly worship God. One may be ignorant of all of the theology or even the proper language or formulas or rituals and still worship God with one's heart without knowing all the theological answers.
Let me press that just a little bit, if I may. Suppose there is a thoughtful and devoted Buddhist. Is there any who has not responded favorably to the good news about God as expressed with reference to the words Jesus Christ? Do we have any hope for the ultimate salvation of such an individual?
Oh, yes.
Why?
Because God is saving people who respond to him even ignorantly, and this could be the case. It would not be a case if the individual were rebelling against what he believed to be truth. It's integrity that makes a person one of God's children.
Okay, then let's circle back to one of the expressions you used toward the end of the first paragraph. You speak of God communicating through us through a called people under the influence of ongoing prophetic inspiration. What is at stake here, Jack?
The stake here is God's using people as a means towards achieving redemptive ends. God chose Israel, for example, as a prophetic community to which he would step by step lead them progressively to an understanding of himself. And I, for example, comparing the New Testament with the Old Testament, am horrified at what I see in the Old Testament. The picture of God there is a crass violation of everything that I hold of value. Talk about ethnic cleansing. Talk about violence, murder, even such things as turning 20,000 horses loose on the hills with their hamstrings cut. I mean, this is violence of the worst sort. But I take comfort from the fact that I feel that way. See, something happened to the human race, the process of dealing with it at that level, that enabled the Christian message to find lodgment when Christ came. The fact that I feel horrified by the terror and the horror of it all is something to which one should turn to God with thanksgiving as a result of his having chosen a people, step by step, leading them on until eventually, progressively, they come to understand the full truth about himself. God himself is horrified by what had to be done.
Why should we engage in activities to spread Christianity then? If God is so benevolently inclined toward all people, why engage in missionary activities? Because
the problem is bigger than individual salvation. There is a conflict here between good and evil that has cosmic proportions to it. And you'll never be able to solve the cosmic dimension of evil unless we can deal with it in a particular present sense. But that individual salvation is not the key issue. The key issue is, are you going to solve the problem of evil? There's evil in the universe. Until evil is eradicated from the universe, we shall continue to experience the horror that sin has brought to the world.
Oh, we just have a minute or two, and so...
And you're asking questions that take hours.
That's right, lifetimes, I presume. But if you could sum up what you would like to say about God in a very brief sentence or two or three, what would it be?
He loves me unconditionally. And once my salvation has made provision for it. And I ask him to help me find my way so that I can experience that saving love in my own life and those lives of my loved ones.
It's hard to respond to that statement, Jack. It's so on the one hand intellectually challenging, but also so personally comforting. When someone encounters evil in some tragedy, in some horrible setback in life, how does that view of God relate to the circumstances of that person's unhappiness? God is there in what ways?
In all the ways that we can answer the question, why me, Lord? This is where the human tragedy comes sometimes, when thinking of my own life, at moments when there were times of tragedy. I just want to relate to that by a transcendent notion that there's more to this than just individual salvation or loss. Human pain must be permitted in order for the final solution. And our emphasis should be on the final solution, the cosmic solution of evil, and put the other things in proper perspective with them.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you for participating in this conversation with us. We will continue our conversation with Dr. Provonsha in just a little bit, and then we will talk more about sin and salvation and how God works for our healing. Thank you. Hello, welcome once again to our conversation with Dr. Jack W. Provonsha, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy of Religion and Christian Ethics at Loma Linda University. In the first portion of our conversation with Dr. Provonsha, we talked with him about his life and his thought as it emerged from Utah and California and Alaska and Massachusetts. In the second portion of our conversation with him, we explored his understanding of God on the one hand and humanity on the other. We want to continue now by exploring the notions of sin and salvation and how alternative understandings of those terms relate to the living of the Christian moral life. So we're glad you're with us. We're glad, Jack, that you are with us still, and we want to continue this conversation with you. What about that word sin? Is that a word that you particularly like and find useful in our time, or is it a word that we should perhaps abandon in favor of more helpful terms?
It's a term that has theological significance only. Because you can't talk about sin unless you also talk about God. You can talk about maladjustment and so on, but when you talk about sin, the term sin itself is a theological expression. And is one that, therefore, as the importance of theology and theological concerns dissipates, it disappears from the scene along with it. Carl Menninger, in his very thoughtful book, Whatever Became of Sin, talks about the going of the notion of sin, how he'd even helped it go. A great psychiatrist who learned to talk about human maladjustment. But sin is a term that has significance only in, as I say, a theological frame of reference.
The difference between maladjustment on the one hand and sin on the other hand is what? Sin refers...
They may be talking about the same thing.
Yes.
But the one can only have meaning in light of theological presuppositions.
Okay, so one sins against God, I take it.
Yes.
But one is maladjusted to society or...
And to being itself, I mean...
To the nature of reality itself. Yeah. What about the term original sin? That's a term many Christians have used over the centuries. Is it one that you frequently use?
One that I reject.
Really? Why?
Because in its connotations out of the Middle Ages, it talks about sin as though it were something that could be passed along hereditarily, that one could be guilty of things which one was never responsible. and therefore is unfair, is a distortion of the nature of evil and its connotations for human behavior, and it is, in my mind, a nonsensical notion.
Now, some people, in rejecting the idea of original sin, have gone so far as to suggest that each individual born into the human family is somehow morally neutral, or perhaps even morally pure or morally innocent. In rejecting the idea of original sin, are you joining that school of thought?
Yes, in a sense. Rejecting it in the sense that it is no description of the reality of our estrangement. That being estranged from our fellow men may be something for which one did not have any part to play. You're just born in a certain place at a certain time with certain people. You should not be held accountable for that for which you are not responsible.
I'd like to press that just a little bit, if I can, to make sure that I clearly understand you. As I gather, the term original sin refers on the one hand to the unfortunate circumstances in which we find ourselves born, and on the other hand to the alleged guilt that we receive from our forefathers and foremothers. Now, do you accept both of those, or reject both of those, or accept one and reject the other?
I accept both of them, except for the responsibility connected with it.
Okay.
I'm not accountable, culpable for my parents' failures, but I'm very much a part of the effect of their causes.
Okay, so I am affected by what my parents did, but I'm not guilty for what my parents did. So maybe you vote with the prophet Ezekiel on that matter.
It's correct.
Okay. What about the notion of total depravity? Do you like that idea? Do you find that helpful?
I think nobody has ever really liked it and found it helpful. It became very much a part of the Calvinistic way of looking at human nature, and I think it was one of the great heresies imposed upon the Christian faith. And our concentration on depravity is over against our concentration on grace is a failure on the part of Christianity to be clear about its issues.
Okay. So then, if we don't want to use words like original sin or total depravity as the first way of expressing what's wrong with humankind, to what terms should we turn? You earlier spoke of alienation. Is that a more helpful way of talking about sin? And if so, what does one mean by using the term alienation?
I think if I had my druthers, I would want us to go back to the word sin again.
Go back to sin itself.
Go back to sin itself.
Mm-hmm.
I heard a quotation from Margarita Lasky, novelist, writer, who was being interviewed on a radio religion talk show. And she made a very interesting observation. She said, "The thing that I envy about you Christians is your doctrine of forgiveness." She said, "I have nobody to forgive me." See, in other words, without the connotations of sin and its relationship to God, forgiveness is not the issue. You not only get rid of the basic underlying fault, the problem, you lose your solution. Forgiveness is a solution to the problem of sin. If you have no such thing as sin, then you have no solution either. You're calling need for forgiveness other things, but it loses its power and impact as a frame of reference within which we can deal with our human problem.
Now, in teaching in a medical school, you have taught philosophy of religion and Christian ethics, but you've also taught psychiatry and served in the psychiatric field.
And more theoretical parts of it.
Right. But so how does the notion of divine forgiveness relate to the sense of need that so many psychiatric patients apparently
it depends upon the psychiatrist.
Right.
A believing psychiatrist will learn how to utilize forgiveness, whether it's called forgiveness or not, as a part of his therapeutic method. In other words, to help another person to achieve a sense of worthwhileness, is in a sense to help that person to achieve forgiveness. Any way you can get at the problem of guilt, which is a universal problem called by a variety of names, but the estrangement, the sense of loss, the sense of meaninglessness, that is so much a part of our world. And there's Margarita Lasky's world, when she says, I have nobody to forgive me. It's universal. We all experience it. But having that without a solution, the solution is one form or another of forgiveness, even if it's social acceptance. it still becomes a medium through which self-worth can be enhanced.
Now, when you talked about salvation in the statement you wrote for the church with which you worship week by week, you spoke of it in terms of being ransomed from guilt on the one hand,
yes,
and power for victorious living on the other hand. I cannot help but think you thought very carefully before you chose that word ransom, given its particular history. Why did you use that word?
No, it says ransom from guilt.
Yes.
That too is thoughtfully put in there.
What were you contemplating when you wrote those words?
There are four things, four elements, four realities that combine to help the human being achieve the solution to his basic underlying human problem. First of all, a person must want to be cleansed or restored to health, or however frame reference you're going to put the original sin state. To help a person to repent from his sin. Repentance comes when you come to realize the nature of what you've done. Every so often we read or hear about people who are condemned for criminal actions but show no signs of guilt or feeling for it. To establish a sense of guilt in the Pauline sense, the scriptural sense, is what the law is all about. To establish a sense of guilt and establish in that person a desire to be free from his guilt, which is what repentance is about. Secondly, there is the forgiveness for that sin that comes when one comes to God and asks for forgiveness. Christians have the answer to Marguerite Lasky's problem. To come and ask for forgiveness. God is always willing to forgive. Then thirdly, the person must accept that forgiveness. That acceptance has to do with self-acceptance. Acceptance of cleansing, acceptance of God's action. And here's where God has provided plenty of assistance in the various theories of atonement that have been part of the theological heritage we all share. The ransom theory of the atonement, for example, was one in which fishermen and sailors in the North African coastline were taken captives by the inhabitants of the area and held for ransom. And it was the motif that preachers are talking about how Christ is a ransom for us. The scriptures even have a passage that can be used that way. But ransom means to be freed from something. To be freed from one's guilt is to be ransomed. See? And I'm suggesting that God's forgiveness is the only answer to the human problem of sin. That's what grace is about. That's what salvation is about. What righteousness by faith is about. God says, "I forgive you," and God's forgiveness is not the same thing as human forgiveness.
Yeah, how do they differ?
They differ in that God as Creator can create a new relationship. He doesn't just say, "I forgive your sin," I remove your guilt. And the belief that God can take my guilt away so that I no longer feel guilty, that relief experience as a reality in my life makes all kinds of new open possibilities, including a new way of living. Because most of our sins we commit are coping mechanisms with underlying problems that are unresolved. Pride, for example, is a major Christian notion of sin. It's not because we think too highly of ourselves, but because of human weakness. That must wear the pride marks to try to establish our sense of worth. Well, God is providing a sense of that worth simply by His forgiveness. And being forgiven for released by ransom from our guilt means we can use all of those theories as metaphors, all of them designed to help us sense the reality which is divine forgiveness.
Okay, but on the other hand, not only do we find ransom from guilt, but we have power for victorious living
which comes as a result of receiving the ransom from guilt.
So they're not totally separate.
No, these are all tied together. And I put them in a series of 4 steps, but they're actually concurrent, much of this. But the ransom from guilt frees one from a constant coping behavior, frees one from the sense of alienation, failure, meaninglessness, which frees one then to creative living.
Now, I've heard some people suggest that we should use the expression righteousness by grace through faith to refer only to the fact that we are ransomed from the guilt of sin and not to the power for victorious living that we also experience. Do you have any comment on that, Jack?
If you are freed from the guilt of your sin, you're already free for creative living. The process of being freed from the sense of alienation and failure provides a whole new window, a window without any guilt in it. One is free then to creative action simply because the coping mechanisms no longer make any sense. Why should I continue to steal and to lie and to misrepresent and to destroy my neighbor when I no longer have any need to establish a sense of worth and value?
So one of the things that makes me powerless in the presence of sin is my guilt.
That's right.
And once that guilt is relieved by divine forgiveness,
then you're empowered.
Then I'm empowered. That's liberating. That's invigorating.
That's correct.
So the distinction between God's grace as mercy and God's grace as power sort of evaporates, doesn't it?
That's correct. It's the same thing.
Effectively, in my life.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Now, when we think of that view of the matter, then when we think about moral obligation, we then ask the question, how ought we to live? If God is liberating me, empowering me for a new way of being, then how can I go about as a thoughtful Christian discerning what's right and what's wrong, where my duty lies and where it doesn't, and so forth?
This is the process by which we, having experienced forgiveness, experiencing grace and empowerment, then in that very experience comes the desire to more perfectly reflect the one we have come to love because of his forgiveness.
So that's the subjective side. That is, myself as a subject is transformed from an individual who doesn't want to forgive, to live honorably, to one who does. But as I do so, I need some objective standards to know. And I read people who say, well, the greatest good for the greatest number, or do that which is best for yourself in the long run, or act by those maxims that can be universalized into, and so forth. And you know all those theories. How does the Christian discern what objectively he or she ought to do in a given context?
I've just finished a series of sermons on the Ten Commandments.
Yes.
In which we noted how enormous the implications of those commandments are, yet how simply stated. Little rules of thumb, thou shalt not kill, without going into all the euthanasia problems and so on. And I observed, at least to my satisfaction, that this was a mark of God's confidence in us. He let us wrestle with the issues, how to apply the general principles He's helped us with. To be free of your guilt, and free then to empowered living, then also gives you the chance to find out how to make that powerful living useful and worthwhile, and follow through with implications, and create a moral structure on the basis of empowerment, not on the basis of a way of solving the problem, but a way of responding to the solution.
Yes. Now, the minute one mentions God's commandments, you won't be surprised if I asked you what your vote is on the old question the Greek philosophers used to ponder. Is something right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? Where are you on that one, Jack?
I play with that conundrum just like you do.
Yes? So you're not, are you not going to cast a vote either way?
You can't. It's a dilemma that cannot be evaded. What you can say is, since God is the creator and sustainer of everything it is, and God is eternally good, it's a meaningless question. What God creates can be nothing but good. And since he's the author of good, it can also only be good. So it's really a nonsensical question.
So you're not going to let me impale you on either horn of that dilemma?
It's the kind of thing the monks used to play with in the monasteries when their time was on their hands.
Right. It does have that whimsical character to it. But isn't there behind that playful question this kind of question? Is God arbitrary? Is God capricious? Or is the morality of the Christian heteronymous, to use an expression that your teacher Paul Tillich used to use, in the sense that we are being asked by God to do something for no apparent reason? And if God asked us to do something very differently tomorrow than what he is asking us to do today, that then would be right. How do you feel about those matters?
Because the circumstances would have changed. I once asked Paul Lehman in a lecture, after the lecture, said, now I recognize that I cannot properly perceive the total situation in which it happens. But is there no such thing as, theoretically at least, a right answer to the moral questions? Is there not a right answer,
Yes.
even if I can't perceive it? He thought for a moment and he said, no, there isn't. Well, no, he was an existentialist, a situationist, as a matter of fact. And to him, the choice itself was the right answer, regardless of what the content of the choice was. If you act in love, that's the right answer. Because there are no such things as right answers that transcend the situation of choice. If you make the choice, then it is the right answer because you've done it in integrity and in love. And regardless of which one it is, it's right because you did it.
That's placing a very high premium on deciding as such, irrespective of what it is one decides, don't you think?
Well, I think that probably the true answer to your question is a combination of a variety of things. Any way that can sharpen up your understanding of a problem and how to solve it in a practical clinical situation is worth taking use of. But just don't make it mean too much. The fact that you have chosen something to the best of your ability means that it was the right choice because it was the best you could do. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't do better tomorrow.
It almost feels to me as though you are suggesting that we be cautious about aligning ourselves with any one moral theory of obligation, but rather we should have a flexible use of them all given the demands of a particular set of difficulties. Am I hearing you correctly, Jack?
That's partly correct. It's not, however, a complete situation of freewheeling. It is the case that the application of the divine revelation does condition us in certain directions.
Mm-hmm.
Thou shalt not kill is a statement, a terribly important statement. But the fact that I don't know at this moment how to resolve that still does not obviate or eliminate the divine command. And then I'm to do the best I can to try to fulfill that commandment. Some things are given, other things must be wrestled with, and I think that the divine commands, the Ten Commandments, are givens.
I think I once heard you just express the Christian categorical imperative, that is, the Christian's ultimate moral obligation as something like this. Always act so as to protect, preserve, and promote the image of God in humankind. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, what does that mean?
You have to define then the image of God in man, won't you? But
right.
It's to be in harmony with the divine intention. God as creator has set up a pattern of interactions that harmony with puts us within the framework of being a part of God's kingdom. Disharmony with, rebellion against, is something else. But God's given us enough clues, givens, within which we can operate. There's not entirely a completely relativistic answer to the question. It's a relativist exploration of the consequences of the given.
Now, the image of God in humankind, is that at all related to the human capacity for freedom, for self-determination?
Yes, correct.
So would I be pushing that moral guideline too far if I said that which enhances a human's capacity for self-determination, for self-direction, is, from a Christian point of view, right? That which diminishes the human capacity for self-determination, to that very extent, is wrong.
That's correct.
Is that a fair summary of your view?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay. Now, as you think about it, are there kinds of actions that seem very likely, in the vast majority of cases, to decrease the image of God in humankind? Do illustrations come to mind quickly?
I suppose if you had to decide between competing claims. Now, for example, a couple of weeks ago, the Time magazine cover was a picture of these two little girls who are joined from the waist down, but are functioning human beings, very cute ones at that, from the belly button up.
Yes.
Now, when one of those children was to become seriously ill, you had to decide between either destroying the life of one or destroying both, then you started to get into a problem. It's a situation where even economics gets into the picture. One could spend an enormous amount of money keeping $1 million fetus or newborn alive, while there are countless other children who are not even having the ordinary necessities of life. Equal distribution of resources makes competing claims. This person has complained over mine, other person. And those competing claims, choosing between them, one might have to consciously say, it is true that if we do this piece of surgery or we provide this piece of, take for example, an earlier case where the two girls were joined at the head.
Yes.
To separate them, you're going to kill one of them. You do the best, put forth the best clinical effort you can to pick out which one will most likely survive, and the other one has to die in the process.
Ah, that's a tragic choice. Maybe I can back off of that almost unbelievably difficult situation to some matters that might seem a little more clear. Maybe, for instance, would it be right to say that when we deny children adequate educations, we are thereby decreasing and diminishing the image of God in their lives, and thereby doing that which is wrong?
And responsible for it, if in some way, or culpable for it, if we're somewhere responsible for that having happened.
Right.
If we can do something about it, do not do something about it, then we are guilty.
That's a good distinction, because there may be children who are deprived through no fault of our own, and we shouldn't carry around false guilt for that reason. Right.
You can't carry the burden of the world on your shoulders.
That's right. Are there other ways in which we routinely and customarily, in your view, tend to degrade or diminish or defraud the image of God in humankind?
Whenever we treat a person as an object, we do this in a sense. That is, what we objectify, we turn into a thing. And our casification of patients, treating them as cases rather than persons, is in a sense a denial of their humanity. And that becomes a diminution of the image of God in such a person. Even if it does not directly affect him and his own behavior and his own attitudes. The fact that you did it to him make you guilty of having minimized somebody else's personhood.
Okay, now there you used a key word, personhood. That in your parlance, your language, the word personhood, is that close to the idea of the image of God?
Yes.
Now, we haven't used the language of Ellen White yet, that is about humans being created in the image of God with
the power to think and to do and not merely reflect other men's thoughts.
What do you think of that?
I think that's a very key expression for what I mean by personhood.
Would we be right to say that anything that increases the power to think and to do, as Ellen White portrayed it there, would be morally right, and anything that doesn't would be morally suspect?
Correct.
Okay.
This would be a useful tool which will not answer all of your questions, but at least it'll be, if it's properly applied, so that in fact within the givens we are functioning, then it seems to me is an appropriate question, kind of question to ask when we become involved in the moral enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Well, when we step back from all of this and look at it somewhat more globally and ask this kind of question, is there anything really different between Christian ethics on the one hand and non-Christian ethics on the other? To what do we turn? We don't have courses in Christian trigonometry, for instance, or Christian anatomy and physiology. Why should we have courses in Christian ethics?
We might very well have such courses.
Mm.
If we took seriously the fact that God is involved in the whole of his creation. Trigonometry practiced with integrity and honesty and humanity and dealing with fellow persons to whom it applies is a Christian kind of virtue. And some Christian virtues are not easily labeled, but are present on the basis of the fact that God is one God and he enters into all dimensions of human experience.
All right. We would like to continue this conversation referring to this way of thinking about the moral life in greater detail in the next portion of our conversation. We'd particularly like to aim at contemporary issues in biomedical ethics, which has been your chief area of concern for many, many years. And we will do that after we've had a little break. But meanwhile, we'd like to thank our viewers for joining us in this conversation and to invite you to come back as we continue our discourse with Dr. Provonsha. We have just a minute, Jack. Is there something more you'd like to say as we conclude this portion of our conversation? Something about the moral life and what makes it distinctively Christian?
What makes it distinctly Christian is the givens. Without the theological base, you're doomed to be playing with various kinds of relativistic answers to ethics. God cared enough about our having the right answers to at least give us a push in the right direction.
Hello, my name is David Larson from the Faculty of Religion at Loma Linda University, and I wish to welcome you to a conversation with Dr. Jack W. Provonsha, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy of Religion and Christian Ethics at Loma Linda University. We are not speaking to you from the campus of the university, but from the home that Dr. Provonsha shares with his wife, Dr. Margaret Provonsha, on the shores of the Puget Sound near Seattle in the state of Washington. In the first portion of our conversation with Dr. Provonsha, we explored his understanding of his own development of thought, his early life in Utah, his education in California and in Boston, Massachusetts, and the various figures who had been greatly influential as he developed his own views. In the second segment of our conversation, we explored his understanding of God and his understanding of humanity and of how these two understandings inform each other. In the third segment of our conversation, we talked about sin and about salvation and about how God brings healing to human beings who then have particular moral obligations. As we talked about those obligations, Dr. Provonsha emphasized that one way a Christian might discern that which is right and that which is wrong is to say anything that enhances the image of God in humankind is for that reason right and good. Anything that diminishes the image of God in humankind, again, for that reason is wrong and bad. Now, it's a privilege for us to discuss these matters with Dr. Provonsha because he is an ordained Christian minister, a physician, a philosopher of religion, a biomedical ethicist, an artist, and a very good friend. And so we invite you to participate in this ongoing conversation with a keen observer of human nature and a very helpful thinker. Jack, thank you once again for continuing this conversation with us. It's a privilege to be in your home here along the Puget Sound and to explore these important matters with you.
My pleasure.
We want to know, first of all, if there's anything more you'd like to say about the basic Christian ethical norm before we attempt to apply that in this segment of our conversation to some more practical issues.
An ethic that is defined as what God is doing in the world to keep human life human must, of course, above all things, define what human means. We've done that in terms of personhood, with the capacity for functioning freely and responsibly, for being aware and self-awareness and so on. These are all defining characteristics of the person. But having said that, that's not enough, because there's more to the ethical enterprise than merely building our case around that particular norm. I like to think of it in terms of three concentric circles. The centerpiece being the norm of Christian ethics. That is, what enhances personhood is right and what diminishes personhood is wrong. But I'm also concerned that society's needs be served by such thinking. And let it take a second circle which says that right and wrong must be also the province of moral thinking at the social level. That is, what society does may diminish or enhance personhood. Mm-hmm. So social institutions must be protected so that they can secondarily protect the personhood. such things as even the state, the laws of the land, marriage, social institutions that tend to support and enhance the quality of personhood, which is our ethical norm. And then there's a third one, which has to do with the sensitivities of the people who are carrying out the enterprise. That is, some things we can do that will blunt our sensitivities so that we become less able to be concerned about personhood. In other words, it's important for us to see to it that we protect sensitivities for personhood as well as personhood itself.
I find that exceedingly helpful, Jack, because many people emphasize personhood in the field of biomedical ethics, but a standard criticism of that view is that that approach is far too individualistic. But with this series of concentric circles moving from the self to the institutions and then to the wider sensitivities, it seems to me that you have done much to overcome that particular criticism of personhood thinking in medical ethics. And I now wonder if we could apply this to some issues in contemporary medicine. I'm thinking particularly of that range of issues that surround death and dying that we might call peri-mortal ethics, beginning with a very basic question such as this. As you understand it, Jack, as a physician and as a Christian minister, is it ever morally appropriate for a Christian to say, I will no longer attempt to continue my life. I will no longer take every possible step to prolong my life. Sometimes this approach would be described as passive euthanasia, and I wondered if you had any observations about it.
The difference between passive and active euthanasia is a significant one in terms of these three concentric circles. The story is told of a very famous rabbi who was dying from a very painful disease. And all of his rabbis came together around his bed and prayed for him, all his friends. They prayed, and as long as he prayed, he couldn't die. So he just lay there in suffering. And finally, his wife had enough of it. She went up on the roof, took a large earthen jar and went over the edge of the roof and dropped it onto the pavement below. The jar hit the pavement with a crash. All the rabbis turned and looked, and the man died. Now, that's passive euthanasia. If she had dropped it on his head, that would be active euthanasia. But the difference being that one has a different meaning. With the one you become, the one who dropped the jar on the man's head became causally related to the outcome. Let's bear some responsibility for it. And it's the meaning of his act that qualifies the moral significance of it.
Now, if I might explore that further with you, I think one of your teachers, Professor Joseph Fletcher, used to contend that when all other variables are held constant, there really isn't a moral difference between allowing someone to die on the one hand and causing him or her to die on the other. And apparently you aren't entirely persuaded of that.
No, I'm not. It would first of all violate the third circle, that is, sensitivities. I have had physicians express to me the outrage, almost personal sense of horror at what they had done. Back at Loma Linda some years ago, a patient who had been released from oncology floor from cancer, she was dying from cancer, was sent home to die. She went at her request. They said she died probably in 2 or 3 weeks. So she went home. In the course of her dying, her parents became frightened and rushed her back to the emergency room. And she came into the emergency room without the usual records from the hospital stay. So she was a new patient to them. So they quickly rallied around her and resuscitated her and got her back in shape again. And there they were. She suffered cardiac arrest when she first came into the ER. They rallied around and brought her back to life again. We were there talking with her. And then the chart came down. They found out that she'd gone home to die, and now they had put her back to life again. She was going to have to die again. So they called up their chief. They said, what do you want us to do? And the chief said, what are you fellows doing down there? Of course, shut off the respirator. They said, oh no. If anybody's going to shut off the respirator, you're going to have to come and do it. They refused. So he came down, checked her out, and shut off the ventilator, and she died. and all of them, including the chief, with a sense of participation in the process. In other words, the meaning of that act was different.
And
the sensitivities could be affected by that meaning.
And you think that was morally appropriate from a Christian point of view, to turn that respirator down so that she expired under those circumstances because she was terminally ill? Am I understanding you correctly?
My understanding was that we'd have to let her make the decision.
Okay, okay. Now, we have sometimes heard the argument that maybe a patient could be relieved of much intense suffering if he or she were caused to die rather than allowed to die. And yet, for centuries, there's been held the view that that's crossing a very, very sacred boundary. Would you care to comment on that further?
I think it is a sacred boundary. We call it a slippery slope in our society. That is, what happens to the individuals who do this has an effect upon them and their capacity to function at the keenest level when their supportive life support treatment and so on is necessary. And I think that no physician can be a part-time euthanist without having that effective sensitivity in someone. I've known physicians who hold the position that anybody over 60 years of age should never be resuscitated. He's now over 60 years of age and no longer saying that, I presume. But there is a sense, you see, in which that judgment is valid. That I would not want someone who practiced euthanasia part-time, looking after my mother who's dying and I want her to live and she wants to live. There's too much at stake to allow certain persons who are in a care position to have blunting of their sensitivities in a way that this would bring about, I think.
You know, keeping in mind your emphasis upon the self and then the institutions of society and then the wider sensitivities that properly inform us all, I wonder if you might apply that to the situation in the Netherlands, where it's reported that increasingly physicians are semi-authorized to actively end the lives of their patients. Now, I'm not asking you to be too much of a prophet, but if we take your threefold criteria, what might we expect to see as the years go by in a society that takes the moves that the Netherlands apparently has taken?
There was an article 2 weeks ago in the New England Journal which suggests that there's a reaction setting in the Netherlands itself. The physicians are moving back in the direction against much less commonly doing this than before, indicating that physicians themselves are becoming apprehensive about the effects of this. Because a significant number of those people in the Netherlands who are being euthanized were being euthanized involuntarily. And that seems to me to be one of those social institutions that has to be protected with great fervor.
So it began in the Netherlands, I understand, as a measure to allow people who voluntarily wanted assistance in dying to have their way, and you're suggesting that the evidence now leads to the conclusion that it moved from there to involuntary deaths. Am I correct?
In meaningless life situations. A person persists in vegetative state for a number of years, deciding to end it all. It's an involuntary action.
Right. Now, let's explore that further then, Jack. Let's suppose I do have a loved one who is in a persistent vegetative state, and that is clinically certain, that the neurologists are confident that this individual is not going to recover consciousness. And this is a Christian member of a Christian family. Does that social unit have a moral obligation to do everything they possibly could do to keep that loved one alive?
The situation you're describing is a peculiar one and has a peculiar answer to it. Sometimes that state can last for a long time. The record that I know about is 37 years and 111 days in a persistent vegetative state, and then died at a cost of about $150,000 every year during that time. An incredible waste of resources and an insensitivity, it seems to me, to the meaning of death. And what is necessary to answer that question is another definition of death. That is, a definition of death that may take the brain but leave the brain stem. It has to have the whole brain before you can pronounce the person brain dead. It needs to be remodeled in terms of the person's situation. We're not dealing here with a thing whose death can be decided on thing terms. We're dealing with a person in which the death is decided in personal terms. And what we need is, I think, a definition that goes something like this. Either personal death, which is not a thing word, person here being a quality of life, or I prefer it now, in the last few months as it's become the direction I've been taking, that mind death is probably a better definition, a more inclusive definition of death that solves many problems. If after considerable observation time, careful testing, checking for organic evidence of death, change in organ structure, taking that plus
the policy issues we have just now, I think, would be, first of all, to keep with the Uniform Determination of Death Act, which suggests that death means the permanent cessation of the entire brain on the one hand, or irreversible loss of spontaneous circulation on the other hand. That would be one approach.
Yes.
I take it that that would not be your first choice.
But I'm suggesting that those definitions of death are thing-oriented. You're talking about the markers of death. The death that we're concerned about is the loss of this person, irreversible loss of the capacity for functioning as a person. And that's more like mind death, which has markers. And maybe the only way you could ever determine mind death would be by the organic markers, such as brain death, interference with circulation of the brain and so on. But what we're looking for is not the marker. We're looking for the reality. And an individual who was 37 years on persistent vegetative state is certainly by all means or any kind of categories we can apply to it.
I'd like, excuse me, go ahead.
Is certainly dead. And in those circumstances, we're not bound morally to keep alive a tissue specimen.
Yes, now, I'd like to try a public policy proposal and see what your reaction might be. When I talk to people, they say that the customary legal definition of death that we have is so deeply entrenched that it will be very difficult to get the whole society to move in the direction of mind death, from brain death to mind death, which is the proposal that you're taking, the proposal that you're offering. I wonder if you would see any light in a compromise position that would say, let's allow the citizens of this nation to determine for themselves whether they would like to have brain death criteria or mind death criteria applied to them. Does that strike you as a reasonable compromise for public policy?
Probably as difficult a policy to obtain as out-and-out legal definition of death in this direction. But the thing that needs to be added to that definition is that, having said so, that a person may be judged as mind death if this has occurred, then the way in which this is carried out is important for symbolic reasons, and for meaning reasons again. In other words, one would still not discontinue a life support system in a too abrupt fashion. At your hospital down there, I checked out one time the guidelines on determining to discontinue life support systems. There's a paragraph in those outlines that say that if the cessation of the life support system results in the immediate death of the patient, you shall not do it. See?
So the immediacy is
the impact upon those who do it.
That's right.
See? This is one of those sensitivity things again.
Mm-hmm. So the prolongation of time protects those sensitivities,
right,
and protects the institutions that are also critical for our well-being.
One might also include other parameters such as the nature of the life support. Invasive procedures might be discontinued.
Right, but nothing that you have said, as I understand it, would preclude a person from accepting the services of hospice, for instance, the goal of which is to provide comfort care only.
No, that's the way to go.
It is?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Dr. Jack Provonsha's in the news much these days, and he is carving out a little space between active euthanasia on the one hand and passive euthanasia on the other hand, with what might be called assisted suicide, whereby the physician doesn't conclude the patient's life, but the patient does so him or herself with the aid of the doctor. Do you have any comments on your colleague in the medical profession, Dr. Provonsha?
I have a personal judgment to make, and that is that this is an insensitive way to approach the problem. To be dragging this all through the courts and trying to establish regulations that permit this kind of an action is to rob the situation of its personal quality. And I think physicians who have been doing this sort of thing for a long time do so out of compassion and care and concern need not have this dragged into the public courts. And Jack Provonsha is damaging the sensitivity aim of the ethical enterprise.
Okay, now a very recent development in your own region here would be the decision of one of the appeals courts to legalize, apparently, assisted suicide for citizens of the United States. First, this was done by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in this region, and then by the Second Circuit back in the East Coast. So it seems as though the distinction between allowing a death and causing a death is beginning to yield to much pressure in our regions. Would you...
That's still on hold, that court case, by the way.
Okay.
Yes.
But it's not so you're saying it's not being implemented yet,
no,
though the judgment has been provided.
It may go as high as the Supreme Court before they're through with it.
Right. And if you were justice on the Supreme Court, you would vote how on these measures?
I would say within certain guidelines, when we should leave this up to the physician and patient. The patient, either directly or through his surrogates, has a right to discontinue any kind of treatment he wants. And to ask to be kept comfortable, but one does not have the right, as the patient, to ask somebody to violate something essential to his role as a clinician.
Okay, now so often people have drawn a distinction between an outcome that is foreseeable and an outcome that is intended. And they might say, well, we can give this patient pain-relieving medications that foreseeably shorten his or her life, but do not intentionally do so. What do you think of that distinction?
Well, it's a bit of casuistry that not in every case is so obvious to apply, but there's a certain truth in it, that intention does qualify the moral morality of an act. If you intend to kill somebody, it's different from accidentally doing it. So the intention is an important aspect of the ethical decision-making, but I should hate to see this as a way around maintaining preservation of the sensitivity circle of our ethical enterprise.
Now, in the moments that we have left, Jack, I'd like to pull back away from these very difficult, painful issues and talk about Christian hope a little bit and ask the question in this way. Is there anything about the hope that a Christian has as an individual and as a member of the Christian community for life after death or for the earth made new that would be of help as one approaches these matters? Does that cast any helpful light on the issue?
I'm not sure that it affects the ethical enterprise as much as it does some others.
Okay. And those others would be in what area?
In the area of general Christian living, one's relationship to God.
Okay.
And in the facing of dire circumstances for one's own life. I mean, you can stand some things if you know it's not going to be forever, and that there is hope for the Christian beyond the grave and beyond this life.
I'm thinking of the death of Socrates and the death of Jesus on the other hand. Two very famous deaths from antiquity, and yet so very different. Socrates apparently serene in the face of death. I say apparently. Jesus quite agonized, feeling abandoned by his Father. How are we to understand all that?
Well, as I understand Christ's death, it was more than just the fear of death or the anxiety about death itself. There was here a burden he carried that was unfathomable almost. cosmic kind of burden. It was a cosmic death. Not anything so simple as taking the hemlock.
Do you think Socrates thought he was really going to die?
He said not.
Right. I remember your book entitled, Is Death for Real? And I think you argued in that book that in some sense it is. Am I correct?
In some sense it is real?
Yes.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not necessarily eternal.
All right. And that gives a Christian some serenity?
Yes.
In the face of...
It makes the hospice circumstance, for example, a much less traumatic experience. Mm-hmm. If as one lies there, surrounded by people who are equally in pain and suffering and anxiety, surrounded by such circumstances, still one is able to look beyond the present moment and, in gratefulness to God, submit his life, what remains of it, to the providence of God.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, other issues that are found in this area of perimortal ethics include the question, what should we do with the baby who has been born with anencephaly? We have just a few moments. Can you comment on that?
By my definition of mind death, the first baby I delivered, by the way, as a medical intern, was an anencephalic. And I had never even seen one. I didn't know it was going to happen. And then here it was. It wiped me out of obstetrics. It's a tragedy, of course. But it was fortunately stillborn, so that there was nothing that needed to be done about it. But anencephaly, by definition, would qualify for my observation about mind death. And all that is necessary in that situation is to carry it out in such a way so as to protect the sensitivities of the community and the family and the others who are doing it. It's important, for example, for parents who are even willing to have their anencephalic pregnancy kept going until the time of delivery so as to have an organ available to someone who needs it. To have them participate in this goes a long way toward giving them a sense of value to it. That helps to relieve some of the anxiety and guilt even that one might experience.
All right. Yet another issue in this cluster of issues concerns the financing of health care for the aged. And you're very familiar with Daniel Callahan's proposal that once one has lived 80 years or so, one ought not to depend on the government for any additional life-sustaining measures. What's your reaction to that?
The older I get, the more cacophonous he sounds.
I see.
But it is a question of equity and of proper distribution of resources.
Is there such a thing as Christian bioethics, and how would you characterize it if there is?
There are Christians who are bioethicists.
Yes.
And doing bioethics from a Christian standpoint is, in a sense, closer to the givens around which our enterprise takes place. And on that basis, one has more certainty as a Christian bioethicist. And I would say that by definition, Christian bioethics does persist. It is not much different from the other because we're dealing with human problems and human problems have human solutions. But because it is closer to the norms, that is not the norms, but the givens, it can proceed with considerable more sensitivity, with more openness, and with more hope and expectation.
Thank you very much, Jack. It's been a pleasure conversing with you here in your home by the Puget Sound.